Emico Part 2, Chapter 2, pages 123 to 130. Their names were Mr. and Mrs. Forrester. Sitting fully dressed at the edge of the pool in the backyard of their home in Harristown outside of New York City, I tried to understand what my first host mother and father were saying to me. I looked along the row of houses that faced the yard, some of their own sheets of perfect blue waters, others with oddly shaped pagodas and winding paths, and an American-style rock garden of a type I had never seen. I regarded the glint of sun on the grass beside the cement patio and looked down through the water and remembered that it was impolite not to look into people's eyes here, even of your elders. I tried, but I couldn't. Despite all we had been told before arrival, I forced a deferential smile and turned away. My host mother smiled for me in return, and her husband took her hand and repeated something I still did not understand. Mr. Forrester spoke softly, and his wife gestured toward my face. Naturally, I understood what was being asked of me, but I pulled the scarf tighter over my nose and looked at the ground, then pushed my feet together and held my knees in my hands. Each spoke my name again in that impenetrable language. I turned my head up and tried to smile. When I nodded my refusal, Mrs. Forrester leaned forward and patted my knee. She stood then and went into the kitchen. Returning with a tray she set on the cast iron table, a glass of juice for each of us. Birds sailed over our heads. I wanted to die. Lifting the scarf away from my mouth, I sipped from my glass. Though not thirsty, I believed I was expected to accept this offering. Hiding my face was not something that had occurred to me when I was living with my grandfather, and only with strangers did I take such care as now. I would never have thought this could be mistaken for vanity or arrogance. I simply wanted to protect people from the embarrassment and shame of witnessing such a monster. I was sure the Forresters had not known what they were getting into, offering their home to our cause. Nor did they understand that I was ashamed to bring this disfigurement into the house of strangers, and that my hesitancy marked my respect rather than my defiance. I was resolved to keep my face hidden those first days. The unmasking would be gradual, for their benefit as well as mine. That night I lay in my new, clean-smelling bed and remembered the old cot I slept on at home, and the many sleepless nights after I returned from the Red Cross Hospital in 1946. My grandfather had begun drinking the terrible Casutoris shochu, which the black marketeers began to manufacture after the war, and which now seemed to accompany him most nights while he worked. He would sit at the kitchen table with the bottle beside him and drink long into the night, rolling new cigarettes from the discarded butts we collected during the day, and he would later sell to vendors in the market district. Just before 9 o'clock, soon after I had rolled my quota for the evening, I carried the radio into my room, turned the volume low, and listened to a program called Missing Persons. Every night, the same disembodied voice read names from a list of relatives who had been separated during the war. Also read out were the names of towns and addresses anyone listening could make contact with to get information. Lying on my cot, I would listen for hours, waiting to hear my mother's name spoken to me out of the darkness. Perhaps somehow there had been a mistake, I thought. It was someone else my grandfather had seen in the garden outside our burned home on the day of the attack. Perhaps she had been spared, and years later she was still looking for her family, as so many people still seemed to be doing. For months I listened to that program, quietly hoping against what I knew to be true. For a short period, too, I listened to a similar program called Who Am I? This was for people who had emerged from the war with no memory of who they were. Many of the stories of disorientation were terrifying. As I lay on my cot listening, watching the soft glow of the radio tubes on the wall, I wondered what it would be like to feel such a sense of mystery about who we were. About who you were, not knowing where your family was out there or if you had the last of your people. When finally the program ended, I would turn off the radio and listen to the quiet, remembering things, and from the next room the sound of my grandfather's muted sobbing would come through my door to stay with me through the night. Mrs. Forrester took me into the city for my second consultation 3 days after I had arrived at their home. The community of Harristown was 40 minutes from Grand Central Station, and from the train that day I watched the landscape come alive before me, while Mrs. Forrester busied herself with the macrame she'd produced out of her handbag. I watched with great interest as the procession of small towns rolled by the window, and when the train stopped at each town in turn, we waited while a second and third and fourth wave of men with briefcases and hats came on board. Outside, the trees and bushes near the tracks moved in the wind we created while rumbling past. It was mid-May now, and almost always warm and pleasant, unlike the dreary weather that had greeted our arrival only a week earlier from Japan. Mrs. Forrester and I were the only women on the train, it seemed. Some of the men who boarded would smile and tip their hats and mutter good morning, but other men would turn their eyes away once they saw us. Soon the only unclaimed seats were the two directly across from us. Clearly no one wanted to sit near me. Finally a man in a dark suit looked up and down the car, and seeing no other seats, reluctantly took one of these. Abruptly he opened a newspaper and began to read. When the train began again, its motion caused his paper to bounce unevenly in his hand. He tried to pad the bouncing and jumping by raising the newspaper over his lap, making it hover in such a way that his arms seemed to float above the turbulence. Some minutes later the train slowed again and stopped, and a man with a narrow, long face and large blue eyes walked up the aisle and sat directly across from me. He seemed to know not to pass up this seat this close to New York, for he didn't bother to look any further. Turning my head away to watch the window scene begin to change as we pulled out of the station, I saw the first man lift up his newspaper again while Mrs. Forrester continued her stitching. The blue eyes landed on me then. I felt them roll over my skin and lift like wet stones and swing in my host's mother's directions, then return to me disbelievingly, quizzically, disgust gathering somewhere beneath. I believed he was wondering if we were together, calculating this attractive young woman's relationship to the Japanese girl whose face was covered by a red scarf. I tried not to pay attention, as I had practiced in my mind so many times before, and watched the landscape scroll by outside. I imagined the colors and the swirls and the speed of our train and the spring landscape, as I did whenever something fascinated me, seeing it in my head as a painting, hoping this would return me to the silence that was so often my refuge in those days. I painted the lives contained within the small houses and farms we passed, and in the lovely little towns tucked between distant hills that seemed more like postcards than real places I could observe and step into. Desperately, I painted the memory of my brother climbing with me onto my grandfather's shoulders as he did his morning exercise. Together we shrieked with joy and pulled at the funny tufts of hair and twinned our limbs with his until he fell backward onto the bed with an exhausted yelp. Somehow we even captured the close, warm smell of his skin as he emerged from sleep every morning. I painted this with colors I had never seen before, the pleasant old man smell that seemed so natural, the powerful strain on his body as he worked to lift his two grandchildren, and the sounds I felt echoing through his old bones. I turned briefly to see if the man had stopped staring, if my silence had worked. His eyes looked like beautiful cold stones. He did not turn away. He grinned and leaned forward. I wanted to rake my fingers across his face when I heard him say Jap, a word I knew, and Mrs. Forrester's expression hardened. He motioned to me with a slight nod and pulled at the loose skin on my cheeks with his fingers. Presently, Mrs. Forrester began tugging at my hand, pulling me up out of my seat and pushing me gently but urgently into the aisle. When I was safely clear, she turned and confronted the man, who spoke again, a sentence I didn't understand at the time but retained in my memory until I came home later that evening. What is that thing with you? The slap of her hand against his face forced all the others in the car to drop their newspapers and cut their eyes upward. I watched the hand come down in slow motion. It was slight and feminine, and it hit the man's face with a loud, ringing clap. "A child," she said. "She is a child." He straightened his back and smiled, as if she'd just confirmed everything he'd always suspected. He shook his head then, and my host mother grabbed my hand and marched me down to the far end of the car, where two men offered us their seats. She shook her head no, and we stood the rest of the way. After we finally arrived, we took a taxicab to Mount Sinai, where Dr. Barsky, the head of plastic surgery, and his assistant, Dr. Simon, were waiting with our interpreter, Helen. I had not seen either of the doctors since the reception day we landed, when the lady had asked me about the television. Mrs. Forrester was shown the lounge when I was led to an examining room. Dr. Barsky patted the table with his right hand, and Helen told me to pop up, that they would begin with my cheek, followed by my eye, then my back. You may remove your scarf, she said. I unwrapped the cloth and bundled it in my pocket. Then Dr. Barsky lowered his face to mine, feeling the heat and freshness and health of his skin. I averted my eyes and sat quietly, awaiting further instruction. He tested my skin. He tapped and pinched and probed. Helen stood in the corner of the room, her arms crossed. I moved when she told me to. Even translated into my own language, much of what the doctor said was incomprehensible. It was a technical language invented to describe creatures like me. When he was through with my cheek and eye, he told me to remove my shirt and lie on my front. I felt the smooth, cool touch of the examining table on my stomach as his hands circled the scarred area and probed the lower back and under my arms. I could not count how many strangers had touched me in this way. Such examinations had become little more than other common daily and weekly rituals, much like eating and going to the bathroom. I knew this was one of the necessities that came with the conditions of my life. I could not recall a time I had been free of this casual manipulation of my body. When Dr. Barsky's hands withdrew, Dr. Simon, a younger man with curly black hair, seized the opportunity to lean in close. I was thinking about the train ride now, and searching my small vocabulary for a way to apologize to my host mother. That incident had been my fault, I thought. I, the ugly one, had been the cause. I searched among the few English words I knew. I didn't even know how to say something as simple as I am sorry. The words did not come. Dr. Barsky then outlined the procedures I should expect in the coming months, while Helen translated. He told us of the series of operations, what each would entail, and how far apart they would be spaced. When I had asked all the questions that occurred to me, Dr. Barsky left me in the hands of Dr. Simon, who was to conclude my initial consultation with a general physician. I was told to remove my dress and underwear. Why? I said, when Helen insisted. She told me to do as the doctor said, that the other girls were waiting. I climbed back up on the examining table, naked but for my socks, and lay as instructed on my stomach. I waited, eyes closed and teeth clenched, for him to begin his test. A cold instrument of some sort touched the skin between my buttocks and began to push into my rectum, but instead of crying, which is what I had believed I would do, what I wanted to do, I swatted away the hand that held it, then sat back up and covered myself with a sheet. Once I had collected myself, it was explained that this message of gauging body temperature was normal for children here. I asked Helen to remind the doctor that I was not a child, and that in any case I should have known that such a barbaric place as this would treat children in a pitiless manner. Well, go on and tell him, I told Helen desperately. But only silence followed my outburst. Tell him his country is a barbaric, monstrous place I should be happy to leave as soon as they let me. Helen refused to translate my angry words, but I believe Dr. Simon had understood. The meaning in my voice was clear enough. He seemed acutely embarrassed and apologized several times. That was when I learned how to ask forgiveness in English, and did so as soon as we left the hospital together. My host mother took me to Coney Island later that day after this shaming episode. When we emerged from the fascinating adventure of our subway ride, we walked into the cool knot of air that enveloped the coast. This was the first time I had seen the Atlantic Ocean from ground level, and it seemed to me a wondrous thing, endless in its possibilities. Far out of sight, Portugal and France rose from her waves, and Spain and England and all the other magical countries I had seen represented on the maps of my childhood. But now they were like my own, still smoldering from the wars that had visited them. I had known them only by their colors and shapes, but now I understood that many of those dark, imagined shapes had been a part of the history that had changed me. We continued along the boardwalk, the ocean and her secret continents to our right. We bought hot dogs, and Mrs. Forrester showed me how to dress mine, all of this without words, squeezing ketchup and spooning relish and sauerkraut. And when I bit into its center, she smiled and repositioned the bun lengthwise in my hands. At the marine aquarium, we watched the bonnethead sharks and imperial angelfish, surrounded by the sputtering of filter pumps and trickles of water, turn their saltwater loops. We saw a purple sea squirt take his late lunch of plankton while a convict surgeonfish picked at purple and red coral, and the grandfather green sea turtle stirred small hurricanes at the tips of his scarred flippers. These were colors I had never seen or hardly imagined to be possible. My life to this point had been lived amid the gray rubble of my broken city. I watched the perfect white Florida manatee nose across the glass wall that contained him. Bright purple ribbon eels craned their necks from rock caves, searching and gnashing their teeth. I skimmed over the strange names engraved in brass at the base of each large tank. These words were impenetrable to me. Raccoon butterfly fish, moon jelly, Keraton lunula, Pelagia colorata. I tried to imagine what they would sound like in my ear, but I had no understanding of the pronunciation of individual letters, much less whole words. Never had I seen anything as beautiful.